Welcome, everybody. My name is Elissa Kaplan, and I am president of the Jewish Historical Society of Fairfield County for the next few minutes. Thank you for coming out on this beautiful day and an hour earlier than we're used to. I hope you are well. So I hope that you have gotten a vaccine if you're eligible to get one and you could get to a place that's giving it. I just have a question, and I hope you're feeling well. How many people would be willing to go, if you have had a vaccine, would you be willing to go to a socially distant event in person? So just thumbs up or raise your hands if you would. Okay, so we have, it looks like we may be having events in person then. So we have a lot of people here who are willing to go. Excellent. As president, I bring greetings from the society. Let me wish you a Zissen Pesach, and I know that because of Abyssal Yiddish, one of our monthly events. That means a sweet Passover, and it's coming up in 2 weeks. Jewish Historical Society of Fairfield County is the home for Jewish memories. We tell the story, the Jewish story in Fairfield County and beyond. It's now time to pass the gavel. So I'd like to introduce Larry Ginsberg, our parliamentarian. And do we have a quorum?
Yes, we do.
Good. And so again, I call the annual meeting to order. At this time, we would normally have a treasurer's report. We have sad news. Walter Morgenthaler is not able to be with us today. His father-in-law passed away on Friday, and the funeral is taking place right now. May Lewis Abbey's name be for a blessing. That's Debbie's father. And for those who are interested, we have Shiva information, which we will share with you. So at this point, I'm about to join a very special and select group of past presidents. And I'd like to recognize all the past presidents, and many of them are here. Irwin Miller, who is the founder of our organization, Lester Sharlock, who will be remembered for so many things, but most recently remembering the family store. George Day Goldberg, who will be remembered for leadership. Julian Reitman, my friend and the guy who twisted my arm in oral histories. Fred Golov is here with us today. David Kweskin, perhaps one of the most organized people on earth. Arnold Yellen, who is here with us today, and you will hear from him in a minute. Maggie Levy, who's coming to us all the way from Illinois, and I hope you're not getting 2 feet of snow. Gail G. Trell, who's super active in everything librarian, family store, and so many other things. And Ava Weller, who's recently enabled us to get a grant from the city for a brand new traveling exhibit. I'm delighted to be able to join this distinguished group. But before I do that, it has been customary at our annual meeting to give awards for leadership and service to JHSFC. So today I am presenting the George J. Goldberg Leadership Award for Outstanding Service to the Jewish Historical Society of Fairfield County. Before I announce the awardees, who the heck was George Goldberg anyway? So Arnold Yellen, can you enlighten us?
Okay. Actually, George Goldberg and his family, his brother, and were brothers in a business called Puritan Cleaners, located on over in the Elm Street area of Stamford for years. George went on to start the Jewish Historical Society, and Larry might be able to, as a founding member, can probably fill you in a little bit more on that time but George Goldberg went on into the investment business and was working with Hurstfield and Stern on Broad Street. And our families were very close together. And when my father went into the photography business and I followed him, I connected with George beside our family friendships. And when George started off with the Jewish Historical Society, he had known me for a while and known me as a native Jewish citizen here. And he invited me in to become a member of the Jewish Historical Society. He explained what it was. I think there were only about 7 members at that time. And I attended a meeting at George's house. He lived up in High Ridge, a section of Stanford. And of course, I grew up with Lester, and we were a lot of organizations together. So I attended a meeting at George's house, and so it was very interesting. And I, being a past president of AZA years ago, I wanted to continue my Jewish interest in Stanford and their organization. So I decided to become a member.
So thank you, Arnold. That gives us a little background of George J. Goldberg. And Larry, as a member of the Magnificent Seven who started our organization, could you tell us a little bit about George Goldberg?
Yes, thank you. I'd be honored to. Thinking back and musing on the formation of the Jewish Historical Society, called the Stanford Jewish Historical Society at the time, Irwin Miller was the brains of the organization. Lester Charlak was the push, but if anything, George Goldberg was the heart of the organization. He was both our first treasurer and our third president. He was a gentle, conciliatory mensch with a penchant for Jewish history, Stanford, learning, and educating. He was the perfect person to convey our mission to the outside world and the Jewish community of Stanford at the time. When I think back, he was also probably our first hospitality chairman. Most of the early meetings with refreshments were held at the Goldbergs. They were both lovely, but now, and most important, for you honorees, please take this with a great concern that you will be honored in the name of George Goldberg, probably, as I said before, the heart of the Jewish organization that we now share. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Larry. And the 2 people who are receiving this award fit that description perfectly. And what we just did is our mission. We're telling people's stories. We're saving those stories and we're telling them and we're sharing them and we're keeping them alive, because that's the just and right thing to do. So first, I would like to present the George J. Goldberg Award for Leadership to Marcy Schoenfeld. Marcy was raised in New York City, and she'll be coming on soon as we find her. And she attended public schools and Queens College. She taught social studies at Greenwich High School for 38 years. She taught a variety of subjects, but mostly American history and AP US government, as well as the advisor for a variety of clubs. She started the mock trial club that won many of their competitions, or Marcy would have killed them. No, just kidding. Marcy even helped out after she retired. Since 1989, she's been heavily involved in Holocaust education and all things Holocaust after being selected to study in Israel. Marcy has done interviews for the Shoah Foundation and has been an active member of the Educators Planning Committee of the Holocaust and Human Rights Education Center for over 20 years. One of the highlights for her was bringing the Anne Frank exhibit to Greenwich High School, where thousands of students and adults viewed the exhibit. Marcy has been involved in JHSFC for almost 10 years. Almost immediately, she became involved in the Oral History Project, which is where I met her, and then education and programs. Marcy has been in charge of all programs, which include book talks and other events. Zoom programs have been a new challenge for her, and she hopes our members have enjoyed them in this new reality. We lovingly call Marcy the Costco Queen. She buys the food and all the materials for all of our events, and she takes care of everything that's needed. And you have shown great leadership and service to our society. So Marcy, I'd like to present you with this gift.
Thank you. I was going to say, if this was television history, the magic of TV, you would hand it to me and I would have it, but we're not that sophisticated and we don't have the capability. But I want to thank you. The award has my name, and it says the George J. Goldberg Leadership Award for outstanding service at JHSFC, presented on this date. It's very sweet. It's very nice. So thank you so much.
Thank you for all you do, Marcy.
Well, I just say I was very honored that Lisa gave me this award. I was very humbled by it. Whenever I would go to Judaica Library at the JCC, I would see the plaque up on the wall, and I would occasionally read the names, and it was all the founders and very active members in the organization. Never would I dream that my name would be added to the plaque. And so it's a very humbling experience. If my parents were alive today, they would be felon. I came from a Jewish home, but it was more of a cultural home. We really weren't religious, but it was traditions, customs, and of course, Jewish food. You can't be Jewish without the food, I think. And that's really how I see myself today. And maybe if I was not a history teacher, or if I didn't got involved in Holocaust education, I'm not sure I'd be in this organization. It all started because I went to a program on the Bilski brothers, and I signed a mailing list. And it's all, that's so tell you don't sign stuff. But anyway, and that's how I got involved. You're right, with the oral history first, and now I wear about 4 or 5 different hats. But it's a labor of love, and I really wouldn't trade it for anything. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Marcy. And next, and much applause. Next, I would like to honor Leah Tillman. So Leah Tillman came to New York with her family on the General C.C. Ballou troop transport ship in 1950 from Germany. Her parents survived the Holocaust by hiding in the woods of Poland for the duration of World War II. When Russia liberated the southeastern part of Poland in 1944, her parents returned to their small town and found it too painful to stay. They decided to smuggle themselves into the Allied sector of Berlin and thus became displaced persons and were sent to a displaced persons camp in Bavaria, Germany. Leah's family was lucky, and actually Leah was born in Stuttgart, in a hospital in Stuttgart. Leah's family was lucky to get sponsored by a voluntary social service agency in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Leah's father was given a job in a meat packing plant. After a year, they moved back to New York, and her father bought a chicken farm in New Jersey, which is where Leah grew up. Like Marcy, Leah also pursued a career in teaching in the Bronx. She worked her way up to being principal of a middle school, and that deserves an award. Leah earned a degree in educational leadership, her doctorate, and was very successful in education. After she retired, Leah volunteered at the Jewish Historical Society. She worked in the library and in the archives. And plus, she's done a lot of other things as well. She has served as administrative vice president and as archives vice president. We lovingly call Leah Queen of the Archives. Congratulations, Leah. Bruce, do you have a gift for Leah?
Yep, sure do. And it's been in hiding the whole time, Elissa.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you for giving me this honor. It's been my pleasure working with all of you to build and grow the Jewish Historical Society of Fairfield County, especially during the last 5 years where you've been president. This year, we've been taken out of our comfort zones to bring our programs to the community and to finish our projects, all via Zoom. I'm looking forward, as I'm sure you are, to the time that we can meet in person and do what we, especially Marcy, do best: serve food with our history and all of our cultural events. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leah. Much applause. Okay, on to the main part of the show. It's now, I'd like to introduce Ann Peskin, Dr. Ann, Captain Ann, as our installing officer. Ann?
It is now time to deinstall our current president, Elissa Kaplan. You have served as the Jewish Historical Society of Fairfield County very well. Please accept thanks and congratulations. However, your job is not complete. You will be in a new position, immediate past president. Your help and guidance are very meaningful to us. Your experience and leadership are greatly valued. You are now deinstalled.
And before I pass on to Peter, the gavel, I just like to say a few words. But hey, it's Elissa. It might not be just a few. I'd like to just talk about the fact that everybody has a story to tell. Your mission, should you choose to accept it. Remember the JCC and our display case? I'd like to first thank our family. I especially want to thank David for everything. Most of you know David as tech support, but David is definitely the wind beneath my wings. I'd also like to thank two very special people who are here, our son Jeff and our granddaughter Ariana, and you see us making Humentaschen at the top there, and at the bottom our daughter Laura and her husband Tom, who are both art conservators, and Jeff is an actor and a teacher of performance arts at Manhattanville College. And Ariana is going to be 16 tomorrow. Happy birthday, Ariana. I'd also like to thank our extended family, David's sister Eileen and her husband Mike, who live in Baltimore, my sister Carolyn and her husband Val Zuckerman, who live in McLean, Virginia, and their children Aviv, who's married to Celine, and Ari. This picture over here on the right is Uncle Howard. And that picture is in the Holocaust Museum in DC and is part of an exhibit of liberators. And we're very proud of his role in liberation in World War II. When I first came into office, people asked me what I was going to do. And I wasn't exactly sure because I didn't really know everything that happens in the Jewish Historical Society of Fairfield County. But I did have 3 guiding principles. And 3 men have really influenced my life. A lot of women too, but I chose these 3 for this particular job. First was Shammai, who lived about 2,000 years ago. Know him well. And he said in Pirkei Avot, Ethics of the Fathers, greet every person with a cheerful face. And I'm a big believer in that. You've got to meet one person at a time and make them your friend. I also was very honored to meet Eric Pleskow, who was president of United Artists and a lot of other things. And in his oral history, which I was honored to be present, to be part of, and his oral history is in our archives because he's a resident of was a resident of Fairfield County. And his one guiding principle in his life was say yes to everything. I agree completely. And finally, for over 50 years, David has guided me through this idea of build community. He grew up in a family where that was the guiding principle, and everywhere we have lived, all 15 places, we have tried to do that. In the past 5 years, I've had a brush with the famous. You can see Meghan and Harry at Stu Leonard's, and on the right is Betty Boop, and Laura's hidden behind the people. And yes, I did meet the former President Bill Clinton in Mount Kisco as we were having dinner. But even more important, I've been up close with the famous people who are local. The Mayor David Martin and I are over here on the left, and he has just given me a check for $6,500 to produce an amazing piece that you will see soon as it's safe to open up, Remembering the Family Store, a documentary about Stanford businesses in 1940 to 1960s. And Mayor Martin said to me, this is a big chunk of money, but use it and leverage it to make something even better. Well, Mayor Martin, we have done just that. On the right is Michael Bloom, who works for Federation, JFACT, and he's our lobbyist in Hartford. He was visiting our archives and speaking to Ava and Leah. And speaking of the archives, we have to go around to a whole bunch of different places to collect things. In fact, there used to be more Jewish historical societies in Fairfield County. Now there's just one. But here's a synagogue in Fairfield where we spent 3 days collecting artifacts and papers and pictures to bring to the archives. And people do come in to our archives and give us pictures of their family businesses. This is a grocery store in New Canaan. We don't just stay in the archives or locally here in Stanford or even in Fairfield County. We have been on the road lobbying at the state capitol. We took an exhibit called Expression of Jewish Identity from Synagogue to Social Action to the Capitol to lobby, and under Michael Bloom's direction. And you can see in the middle picture that we took artifacts from the archives, and what's down here at the bottom are pictures of people that we interviewed as part of our oral history project. They're all Jewish politicians who were elected in Stanford actually, and their quotes on the posters tell you why they went into politics, and a lot of them said, for Tikkun Olam, to repair the world. And you can notice in the pictures that we had both Democrats and Republicans visit us, and we were happy about that. And do you remember the Maccabi games? Well, we went all the way to West Hill High School in Stanford, which is not very far for non-Stanford people, to set up our traveling exhibit, which was a huge hit with the volunteers and with the athletes and the coaches and the visitors. And then we acted as a JCC care site for the Maccabi Games. And we brought some of these young people into the archives where Leah explained some of our pictures, historic pictures. Deborah allowed them and got them started working on some of our artifacts and what's in the boxes. Hank Silverstein explained our database. Boy, I wish he'd explain it to me. And I was talking to them about oral history. We asked all the people who were there, when I think of history, what comes to mind is, and I challenge you to think about that too during this presentation today and in the future. We went to Beth El Fairfield. There's so many Beth Els in Fairfield County, but we found this one and we were in the parking lot all day. It was a warm summer day, selling and promoting the Jewish Historical Society of Fairfield County. One of the highlights was meeting Spider-Man. We also have sent our artifacts on the road, and this is Sophia Falk's Marks. And we had these photos in our archives, and they ended up in the Greenwich Museum exhibit of Jewish family stores. And you see that they gave us credit, courtesy of the Jewish Historical Society of Fairfield County. We've also visited other historical societies to network and to learn. And here Leah and I went to the Westport Museum and Historical Society. Over the past 5 years, we have had 2 heritage events. In 2017, we honored Lester Sharlock. We honored young people, BBYO presidents. We honored Jeff Erickson, and we honored David Levinson. And you can see that we had a classical music concert, and we were delighted to be in Norwalk for this presentation. In 2019, we highlighted Holocaust education, which is one of our major tasks and major missions. And of course, we honored and do still honor every day Judy Altman and Agnes Ferdis. Agnes was a member of our board for many years, and Judy shows up once a month to lead Abyssal Yiddish. Our big project for the past several years has been remembering the family store. And here's a picture of Lester Sharlock. And look, they're handing him money. And this group met, and as Leah mentioned, yes, we always have food. The woman talking to Ava at the bottom is Sharon Farrer. She produced a family stores exhibit in Asheville, North Carolina. We were in touch with her, and she came to Stanford, and she visited our archives and has helped us with this project in the very beginning. And here's what happens when you put a lot of work. Here's Lester at the Senior Center, giving his speech and showing the slides. And Gail G. Trell has been the chair along with Lester, and now she's the chair by herself of this enormous project. Complicated and beautiful, and it's going to win lots of awards. And you see Steve Karp on the right is doing the narration. So we have so many events. Over the past 5 years, we've probably had about 40 book talks. And here is one of the book talks. Marilyn Schwartz is sitting in her wheelchair at the front talking about her book. And over here behind the people is Marianne Hoberman and talking about her Strawberry Hill books. That was in Greenwich. And yes, we did used to have food at every single event. Is that Ruth Bader Ginsberg? Oh no, it's Dr. Judy Katz. Okay, Judy. So there she is giving a review of the autobiography. And at the top, we have Sonia Meltzer, who's a Philip Roth expert. And she reviewed all of Philip Roth's work while standing on one foot in less than an hour. Quite a feat and wonderful. And as you can see, we get nice large crowds for our book talks. They're very popular and very educational and very inspiring. And we have so many programs. Jewish pirates? Dr. Ann Peskin, Captain Ann can tell you about that. And one of our programs was going to New York. Roz Nessen organized our trip to Fiddler auf dem Dach, Fiddler on the Roof. And I just wanted to point out this picture of Evie Fowler, one of our, I don't know if not original, but one of our members, longtime members. And we even had Michael Takeif put on a one-man show at the JCC. So we went to see a play and we helped produce a play. And we had so many other programs that we've sponsored with other organizations, like the Darien Library, where we had a program about an artist, Jewish artist, Modigliani. And at Temple Sinai, we had a program about Leonard Bernstein. We've actually had 2 of those. There's highbrow and hardworking, and we had programs about Jewish farmers in Connecticut as well. And we showed the film Harvesting Stone and heard from the last Jewish farmer in Connecticut. Can you believe that we had a murder mystery in the archives? Louis Drucker murdered on Christmas Day in the end of the 19th century? Yes, and the archives got transformed into almost like a speakeasy on a dark and stormy February night. And this program was geared specifically to Jewish 20s and 30s, and they had a blast. One of the reasons, you can't really see it here, but there was gin and rum punch. We couldn't do any of this if only 1 or 2 people contributed, but everyone on the Jewish Historical Society board for the past 5 years has worked so hard and has had so many great ideas and has volunteered to do all sorts of things that they never thought they would ever be doing. They were certainly out of their comfort zone and into their comfort zone. They're very helpful. And you can see that we've had probably 60 board meetings, and including retreats and summer socials over the past 5 years. And you can see that we are at Polina and Vlad Lifskin's house for one of our summer socials. And here we are meeting as a board the way we did once a month for 10 of the 12 months out of the year. So I thanked my family, and I want to thank the best board in history. I also want to say that the Jewish Historical Society, again, Fairfield County, is the home for Jewish memories. We tell the Jewish story in Fairfield County and beyond. And we have a mission. We have to do justice to people whose stories can't be told or might have been forgotten. We are, whether someone died in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire, or whether there's a person in our family who might not be remembered and whose memory we want to keep alive, it's the just and right thing to do, and that's our mission.
Strive to be human, dare to make a difference, dare to be different in the face of indifference, to be the eyes of the vision, the voice of those who cannot speak, to stand by the lonely and to carry the weak. Yes, we must stand above the crowd, raise our voices loud, from our actions be proud. Yes,
That's what we do. We're the voice of those who cannot speak. Thank you for this most fantastic chapter in my life. It's been a wonderful 5 years.
Thank you, Elissa.
Yes, lovely.
Thank you and to our family, the board, and all of our members. And now it's time to pass the gavel. Carol, I think I need your help. To Peter. Peter, here's the gavel.
Wow. I didn't know this was going to happen in real time. I got it.
That was great. Can you hear me now?
Okay. It's even engraved. My goodness.
Well, that was a wonderful review of the past. Thank you so much, Elissa. And now it is time to install our new president, Peter Lilienthal. It is my privilege to welcome you as president of the Jewish Historical Society of Fairfield County. I congratulate you and know that you will always strive to do your best, undertaking all your new responsibilities. The success of JHSFC is not based on one person alone, but on this entire board and membership when they work together as a community. Always remember, the Jewish Historical Society of Fairfield County is the home of Jewish memories. We will tell the story, the Jewish story of Fairfield County and beyond. You are duly installed. Congratulations and mazel tov.
Thank you very much. I have the gavel and everything. So I got a few words that I'd like to say about Elissa. Elissa, how lucky we are. While you have stood on the shoulders of 10 presidents, you have brought us to yet another level and greater level of relevancy, leading us from getting creative grants, including Remember the Family Store that you mentioned, digitization, it happened here, leading us in tribute to Holocaust remembrance in our heritage event a year ago, November, provided a full year dedicated to a complete review of our bylaws and governance, and providing a program on the archives this past November. But most importantly, we didn't miss a beat. During this most difficult year, we've continued to grow from strength to strength. You also never forgot to honor each of us with the recognition of the Shoshana Award when something special has been accomplished. Now, we as the Executive Committee, Board of Directors, Council of Advisors, and staff honor you with a Shoshana Award.
Oh.
So here we are. Shoshana Award presented to Elissa Kaplan, President of the Jewish Historical Society of Fairfield County, for your vision and dedicated service, 2016 to 2021. Today, Sunday, March 14th. There you see the Executive Committee, the Board of Directors, Council of Council of Advisors, and staff. And we all love you. And with your leadership, you have made our organization yet better than it ever was, even though it was always fabulous. But in addition, you'll always be in a position to display the honor. And we've also, in the process, going to be gifting you a pin, a Shoshana Award pin, which you can in fact wear when you display all your beautiful scarves and blouses and so on. And this Shoshana Award will be with you always. And you can display the Shoshana Award, that certificate that we gave you. It is framed and can be mounted any place that you choose within your home. But in all fairness, you've had a wonderful partner who has been by your side making technology magic. We too want to honor your partner with a specially preserved and treated Shoshana roses, which will last for over a year. So the two of you together now are passing on to the next generation of leadership, but I know you're not going anywhere, and I will not let you. So thank you for everything, Elissa and David, for such a wonderful period of time, and all the very best. And congratulations to you.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, everybody. Very touched.
And thank you, Peter.
And thank you both. Terrific. And you know what's also great after all of this? You've become dear friends. And you know what? That is the real award that you're giving to all of us, and to Carol and to me. And thank you so much.
So, Peter, I think we need to adjourn the meeting.
Oh, excuse me, that's my job. So I would like at this point to entertain a motion to adjourn the annual meeting. Is there a second?
So moved. So seconded.
Okay, so let's all show our hands, all in favor. Show hands of all against. Anyone against? The motion passes. The annual meeting is now adjourned.
So thank you, Peter, for that. I'm going to jump in here so that I can introduce our program, and remembering the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire. We have several parts of the program. Dr. Laura Ping will be speaking. Next, we will honor the memory of Yetta Goldstein by Michele Esterman, and we will be honoring the memory of Bella Zwyman-Wolfson by Rhonda Ginsberg. And we will have time for questions and answers and memories that you'd like to share. So Laura J. Ping received her PhD in American History from the Graduate Center, City University of New York in 2018. She's particularly interested in the history of New York City and women's history. Laura's working on a book, Beyond Bloomers, Fashioning Dress in 19th Century America, where she analyzes the cultural and political impact of dress reform movement on 19th century women's movement in the United States. Laura has been awarded a 2020-2021 David Jaffe Fellowship in Visual and Material Culture from the American Antiquarian Society. And Laura's been teaching history for 16 years, hard to believe it, at a lot of different places: Pace University, Gilder Lehrman Institute, George Washington Teacher Institute, National Endowment for the Humanities Institute for School Teachers, and the Macaulay Honors College, Queens College. So, Laura, please tell us why the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory is so important to talk about today. Why is it still a hot topic? Take it away, Laura.
Yes, I'm going to share my screen. And everyone can see my screen? Yes? Okay, perfect. Okay, so I really related a lot to what you all were saying about history being the stories of people. So something I encounter a lot when I speak to the public or even teach is that everyone remembers history, especially in high school, being about memorizing names and dates, and not pleasant for that reason. But in reality, history is the story of people. And so we always want to remember that these were people's lives, that there's humanity in history. It's not just about dates. And the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire is one of these major watershed events in American history, not only because it changed labor practices, but because it highlighted the experience of certain marginalized people in the United States. So United States immigration between 1880 and 1920 exploded. Due to persecution in Europe and economic depressions, 20 million immigrants from Central, Eastern, and Southern Europe came to the United States. Between 1890 and 1900, not 1990, there were 600,000 Italian immigrants who were largely fleeing an economic depression. And between 1890 and 1920, 2 million Jewish immigrants, largely fleeing religious persecution. So in places like Poland, there were laws that the Jewish community couldn't own land. In certain towns, there were also restrictions on how many Jewish people could get married per year. The idea being too many marriages might lead to too much procreation, and you might end up with a larger Jewish population than the leadership wanted. So there's a lot of really terrible things happening in Eastern Europe. And so people are coming to the United States for opportunities. And one of these opportunities are the factories. So we're in an industrial period. It's not the only industrial revolution in US history, but it's one of the big ones. And so the fact that you can come, you can get weekly wages, find a job relatively easily, and practice your religion without this legal persecution was enticing to a lot of Jewish immigrants. Now, the majority of these immigrants settled on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. At the turn of the 20th century, this was really the capital of Jewish America. This is Hester Street, this image. So if you're familiar at all with the Lower East Side, you'll know Hester Street. And it ended up being an incredibly densely packed area. Not only are there 700 people per acre in the year 1900, but there are factories, there are tenements, there are docklands, there are also synagogues, mutual aid societies, and stores. So the benefit to this for newly immigrated people is that you didn't have a lot of culture shock, for lack of a better word. You could find other people that spoke your common language, practiced your faith, had similar backgrounds. Now, the Jewish community are not the only ones immigrating to the Lower East Side at this time. As I said, there are Italian immigrants, and there are also Chinese immigrants. This is the period of the Chinese Exclusion Act. So the United States government is doing everything they can to keep the Chinese out, but there is a Chinatown. So each block in the Lower East Side would have been the home to one of these immigrant groups. So you had lots of people living next to each other, maybe even in the same buildings, but not necessarily socializing with one another. People kept very within their ethnic communities. So if we think of it as being kind of a microcosm for the melting pot of the United States, the Lower East Side is this fascinating area where you have so many different languages, so many different types of cuisine, so many different faiths, but people are able to create small communities within those languages and backgrounds so that there isn't this harsh assimilation period as perhaps people that immigrated in other generations experienced. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that it's wonderful living on the Lower East Side. The tenements, which would be like very small apartments, were incredibly overcrowded. There isn't any daycare, there aren't necessarily public schools, and so people's children are running the streets during the day while the family is at work, and it's not necessarily a safe neighborhood. This is the beginning of social work, this period of the early 1900s, and so the Lower East Side really becomes a focal point for these social workers, one of whom was Jacob Reese, who remembered that when he was exploring the Lower East Side, he found in 3 rooms father, mother, 12 children, and 6 boarders. They slept on the half-made clothing for beds. I found that several people slept in a subcellar 4 feet by 6 on a pile of clothing that was being made. So this image shows us what it might have looked like inside one of these tenements. You have multiple families living in 1, 2, or 3 bedroom apartment. There is no protection against fire. This is a hotbed of disease, right? Think if someone gets the flu, right? Everyone gets the flu. There's no clean water and there's no privacy. So when we think about the Lower East Side and we think about the experience of these immigrants, there's a couple of perspectives that we want to consider. The first is that there are opportunities in the United States that immigrants didn't have in their home countries, one of which being jobs, another of which being safety to practice your own religion. It's not that there's not anti-Semitism in the United States, because of course there is, but it's not government sanctioned the way that it would have been in Eastern Europe, where the government is organizing mobs to attack Jewish communities. So on one hand, we have more opportunity in the United States. On the other hand, immigrants are living in extreme poverty, and they're living in extremely close quarters. Now, the majority of these immigrants would have worked in the garment industry, in sweatshops. So the original sweatshops come out of the tenements. So you would have had 3 rooms, one of which would have been a bedroom, and I'm just going to go back like this, where you had lofted beds and people sleeping on the floor. Another would have been a kitchen, and then you would have had a workroom. And in this workroom, it doubled as an office and a tailor shop, and you would have had a lot of people, perhaps everyone in the family working together, perhaps other people that lived in your building coming in and working. And the way that the garment industry was set up is that they didn't have these big factories yet, and we're talking about around 1900. They would have assigned people piecework, which means that you contract someone to make shirts. And within your little home business, one person would be cutting the pattern, another person would be creating the buttonholes, another person would be sewing the collar, and perhaps yet another person would be doing the ironing. The families were paid by piece, not by the hour. So the faster that you can work, the more money you can make. Now, one of the things that makes this possible is the mass production of the sewing machine. So you can see here, this family is working on a sewing machine. The sewing machine has been around since around the 1850s, but they were incredibly expensive. What changes around 1900 is that it gets cheaper. You have companies like Sears and Roebuck who are mass producing these sewing machines, and you can buy them on installments. So you can use credit so that you can afford to buy this sewing machine. So this becomes more imperative that you're producing pieces of clothing so that you can make your payments on your sewing machine. But the sewing machine also shifts the expectations of the people that are hiring these workers. Now they know you're not doing everything by hand, they have greater expectations for what you can produce. So this is a very hard life. Part of the reason that people have so many family members or boarders in their apartments is because it takes that many people to earn enough money to pay the rent. So the adults are working, doing this piecework 16 hours a day, 6 days a week out of their homes, while the children are running in the streets without a sufficient place to play or public schooling. So this is in part what the social workers are doing on the Lower East Side at this time, building parks, trying to get kids in school, trying to help these workers get better labor conditions, but it's a very slow process. Now, by the time we get to around 1910, we're starting to see a shift away from this piecework out of people's homes and into factories. And one of the most popular garments that are being produced at this time is the shirtwaist. So a shirtwaist is a woman's blouse. It's loosely designed based on the style of a man's shirt. And the beautiful thing about the shirtwaist is that it allows for versatility and it's inexpensive. So prior to the advent of the shirtwaist, women wore these long gowns that had many undergarments, and they were quite expensive. So a poor woman might own 4 dresses, if she's lucky, at one time. One would be a dress for more formal occasions, such as church services, and then she might have some work dresses. She might only own 1 dress. as opposed to wealthy women that would own many, many dresses. And so it was apparent if you owned one dress, this is the dress you're wearing every single day, and then this is the dress you wear to go to services. The shirtwaist challenges that because as a blouse, it allows women to own one or two skirts, but many shirtwaists. So not only is it hygienic, right, that you don't have to wear the same dirty clothes for as long, perhaps, because you have more pieces, you can change them out, but it's also fashion. So instead of wearing one dress and everybody notices that, you could wear the same skirt every day and switch out your shirtwaist. And so it looks like you've got a different outfit every day. And so while that might sound a little frivolous, it's really important to the identity of these immigrants to feel as though they're embracing social mobility. The United States is unique in its social mobility that you could be working class and work your way into being middle class. A good example of this is Andrew Carnegie, who immigrates from Scotland and is incredibly poor and then works his way up to being one of these incredibly wealthy robber barons. This is the dream of the immigrants. And so fashion provided a symbol of this social mobility. Look, I'm making enough money that I can buy more than one shirtwaist. Look, I'm dressing fashionably, which is something perhaps you hadn't been able to do in the past. So the demand for the shirtwaist leads to mass production of the shirtwaist. And this is really when we begin to see department stores becoming a major activity for women to wander around together and to shop, and also to walk in and buy something off the rack. So this again has been going on for a few decades, but it was really something not available to working class women, that you could walk into a department store, grab something off the rack, and wear it the next day. We think of that as being pretty ordinary, but for them it was brand new technology. And so the shirtwaist is an indication both of technological advances, but also the identity of immigrant women. The shirtwaist is also the symbol of the new woman. The new woman is also sometimes referred to as the Gibson Girl. So the Gibson Girl is designed by illustrator Charles Dana Gibson, and she is the modern woman. So we're seeing a shift in women's rights. Women don't yet have the vote nationally, but some states are starting to pass the vote individually. So for example, New York State passes the vote in 1917, 3 years ahead of the country. The Gibson Girl represents someone who doesn't ascribe to Victorian notions and sensibilities. She puts off getting married. She perhaps goes to college. She works a job. Maybe she moves in with roommates. She wears a shirtwaist and she rides a bicycle. So there's a lot of independence behind the image of the new woman and the Gibson Girl. And so again, this is fueling the popularity of the shirtwaist. Now, all of this demand for shirtwaists results in the garment industry seeking to meet this demand. And so one of these factories was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. They primarily hired recent Italian and Jewish immigrant women. Some men worked there, but primarily women. These women were as young as 14 years old. So we see again where labor laws were different back then, that you didn't have child labor laws like you do today. You obviously didn't have hours. Right now, a 14-year-old can only work a few hours at a time. Not the case in this time period. And the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was also a non-union shop. So this is a period when we see a lot of union activity. People are campaigning for things like the 10-hour workday. They're campaigning for more money. They're campaigning for safer working conditions. But primarily these unions are white male-run unions. And these immigrants are very vulnerable to bosses that aren't open to union activity. Honestly, I don't know if any of the owners of factories would have supported union activity, but certainly these young women who could have easily been fired, who were concerned about their immigration status, would have been more vulnerable to bosses saying, no, you're not allowed to unionize. Now, that doesn't stop everyone, because some of the women working at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory did join the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. This would have been very radical of them. It would have been very progressive, and it would have opened them up for criticism, perhaps violence, arrest. So to join a union at this time was something very brave. Now, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was located in the Ash Building at 2329 Washington Place. So this building's still there. It's just off of Washington Square Park on the west side. It's part of NYU now, so now it's the Brown Building. But you see they do have a plaque, as I've posted here, that commemorates the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. And so the factory itself would have been on the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors, so the very top floors of this building. So Greenwich Village would have been a slightly more upscale neighborhood, still lots of factories, but you've got some upper class people that have moved to Greenwich Village to escape really the kind of the disease and the overcrowding of the Lower East Side. The really wealthy are now living on the Upper East Side because Central Park, which was finished in 1876, is enticing people because of the view. But these women would not have lived near the factory. Typically, they would have lived on the Lower East Side in these tenements, in these slums, and then traveled to Greenwich Village to go to work. So this is a photograph of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. You can see that the women would have worked very close together. You can see that they're working on machines. One of the things that factory owners encouraged for the garment industry was for women to own their own sewing machine. So this tells us something again about labor practices of the era that they're not providing their workers with sewing machines, they're expecting them to own their own, which would have also involved carrying it back and forth from work every day. And these things were incredibly heavy. If you've ever had a chance to try to lift one of these old Singers, you know, they're cast iron, so they're heavy. So again, they're not being provided with adequate tools. They're expected to provide their own tools. They're working in very, very close conditions. They would have earned $3 a week, which is not very much money. Of course, men would have earned about twice that. And many of these women were afraid to join unions. Their immigration status made them feel vulnerable. Their income was likely integral to their family's comfort and ability to keep their housing. So someone losing their job would have been really detrimental to the security of the family. But the factory owners also did everything they could do to discourage women from joining unions. So in 1909, the women of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory actually walk out. They walk off the job, they try to go on strike, and the bosses hire these thugs to attack these women and physically intimidate them so they go back to work. And this is a pretty common practice of this time, this union busting, where you hire, I suppose they would be considered security guards, but really they came in with baseball bats and were told to, you know, don't hold back if it comes to breaking up these union strikes. So a lot of this union activity is being fueled by the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. Their major agenda was to fight for better working conditions and protective legislation. In 1909 to 1910, they led the uprising of 20,000, which was specifically a strike geared at women working in the shirtwaist industry. The Triangle is not the only factory, obviously, producing shirtwaists in New York City. And so they're directly addressing their union activity to the women in this element of the garment industry. And as I said, in 1909, 400 employees walk out of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. So these women are aware, right? They're participating in unions, but they're being discouraged by their bosses who are hiring thugs to intimidate them. But they're also aware of their working conditions. Having a job for these women is not feminist. So if we think of middle-class American-born white women who might have said, well, I went to college and now I've decided I'm going to be a teacher, that could be considered feminist, right? Because you don't have to work, but you're choosing to work and you're choosing to challenge traditional gender roles. For immigrant women, especially these lower class women, this is a necessity, right? They don't enjoy the privilege of being able to say, my father will take care of us or my husband will take care of us. They had to work if they wanted to eat. So when we think of feminism during this period, we want to very much be clear on labor and who has power in their labor and who doesn't, and how that's divided by both ethnicity, nationality, and social class. What is feminist about this period are the women that then decided that they didn't need to work in these less than ideal conditions, and they were in fact going to protest these conditions. One of these women was Clara Lemlick, who was the leader of the uprising of 20,000. She was very successful in helping to rally these Jewish immigrant women, because instead of standing up and speaking in a general sense to a large crowd, as many of these union activists did, she got up and spoke in Yiddish and called for action. So one of the reasons that they're having a problem organizing is they have women who are Italian, they have women that are Jewish, maybe some Irish women, maybe some American-born women, and they're speaking to them all at the same level in the same way. And these women don't have the same concerns. They also don't all speak the same language. And so for Clara Lemlick to get up and know her audience and speak to her audience, both in an impassioned way, but in Yiddish, which very much said to them, I'm one of you, I understand your trials and tribulations, it really inspired a lot of people. And it's Clara Lemlick who is supporting the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory strike, even though the women are very much being intimidated away from striking. Clara Lemlick does not work at the Triangle Factory. She, however, does have a cousin who does. And so she remembers later, she's very moved by the fire because she's been working with these women to try to unionize. And once the fire's over, she is left searching morgues, looking for her cousin who's missing. And when she's finished searching and hasn't found her cousin, she remembers just sitting down and laughing hysterically because she's so relieved. So the fire itself happens on Saturday, March 25th, 1911. It's the end of a 52-hour work week for these women. So that gives you a sense of the working conditions. They're working 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. The only day they get off is Sunday, which you can then see is a very Christian-oriented system, right? Because they're not considering the Sabbath on Saturday for their Jewish employees, but they're also not considering the amount of rest that a person needs to work that many days. I can't even imagine that many hours in a week on a regular basis and being 14 or 15 years old. On that day, there are 600 workers in the building. The fire breaks out on the top floors. So remember, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory is on the floors 8, 9, and 10 of the Asher building. The owners had locked the fire escapes and the exit doors. So there is one fire escape. And perhaps you noticed when I showed the photograph of the Triangle women working, there was actually a sign for a fire escape. There's one fire escape. It ends up collapsing. And all of the exit doors are locked because the owners didn't want women taking breaks. They didn't want them taking smoke breaks. They didn't want them taking longer lunches. They were also afraid that these women would steal. And so by locking them in, they believed they were ensuring more workplace productivity. So once the fire escape collapses, these women are completely stuck in the building. The firefighters do show up, but their ladders won't reach beyond the 7th floor. So you have women that are caught on these upper floors. The elevator is working, but you can only take so many people down at a time. And eventually the elevator does collapse and over 30 people are found dead in the elevator shaft. Other women start jumping to their deaths. Now the firefighters have nets on the sidewalk, so they're anticipating this jumping, but they're not anticipating the amount of people jumping. And so the nets also rip because they can't hold all of the people. The fire lasts for roughly an hour and a half, and in that time, 146 workers died, majority of them young women. The youngest was 14. Now, this fire really demonstrated everything that union activists had been trying to communicate about the hazards of these working conditions. The lighting was kept very dim at the Triangle factory. The doors were locked during business hours so that women didn't have a choice but to stay at their machines. And prior to 1911, the factory had already experienced 2 fires, and yet the owners had resisted installing sprinklers. So the legacy of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory is very related to the working conditions we enjoy today. The city is outraged and appalled by this tragedy, partially because people have no way to identify their loved ones who are badly burned or badly mutilated from jumping out of windows. They're primarily identifying women by their shoes or by their jewelry, something that they were wearing that day that's indicative of who this might be. But it takes several days for everyone to be identified. There are photographs of these bodies laid out on the sidewalks waiting for family members to come identify them. And there are other photos of women laying in rows in coffins in the morgue, waiting for their families to come identify them. Now, the National Women's Trade Union League is enraged. Obviously, this is exactly the kind of thing they've been trying to prevent. And so they send questionnaires about factory conditions through all of the local newspapers on the Lower East Side to get a response about what kinds of conditions people were working in. And they get hundreds of responses. And so the Women's Trade Union League is able to form a group called the Citizens Committee for Public Safety. And they're able to put pressure on the state government and the city government to try to enact fire safety prevention. And so this is where we get the Bureau of Fire Prevention. This is also where we get safety devices such as fireproof materials and stairwells, fire alarms, fire extinguishers, and fire hoses within buildings. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire also greatly inspired Rose Schneiderman, who was another union activist. She was one of these immigrant women. She worked, she had been born in Poland and immigrated to the United States. She was a known socialist and feminist and worked with the New York Women's Trade Union. It's Rose Schneiderman who coins the phrase bread and roses, which means that women should be able to work for something more than basic sustenance, right? You should be able to afford bread and roses. And so it's after the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire that Rose Schneiderman really amps up her union activity and begins protesting unsafe work conditions. And she also uses this to help pass the 1917 New York referendum that gave women the right to vote. Women working in these factories were largely more concerned with union activity than they were the vote. And so it's women like Schneiderman who are able to explain to them that if these women have the vote, if women can vote, they can also have a say in the laws that are going to protect their working conditions. So part of the reason that the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire is still such a big deal is not only just the tragedy, but it's what comes out of it. It's the empowerment of women to declare and assert what kinds of working conditions they'd like to see in their workplaces. Also holding accountable these factory owners who had so dismissed the lives of these young women who died in the factory fire. Thank you. Elissa, you're muted still.
Okay, thank you, Laura. What we'd like to do now is hear from 2 people who are direct descendants of people who were there or who worked in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, who were there or not there, as it seems, and who worked in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. And the first one is over here, Michele Esterman, who will tell us about Yetta Goldstein. So I'm going to, why don't you start speaking, and then I'm going to put some pictures up, Michele, okay?
Okay, very good. All right, you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. My name is Michele Esterman, and I am a member of the Jewish Historical Society. And this part of the program is entitled A Tale of Two Women. So I'm going to speak about one of the women, who is my great aunt, Yetta Goldstein. I want to thank Marcy Schoenfeld specifically for inspiring me to become active in the annual Triangle Shirtwaist Fire Memorial held in Lower Manhattan, where surviving relatives turn out in force, including yours truly. My great aunt Yetta Goldstein was one of the 146 garment workers who perished March 25th, 1911. Yetta emigrated from Białystok, Poland, just 4 years before the fire. The family was in Paterson, New Jersey, which at that time was the silk capital of the world. Her father was Chaim Moshe, the weaver, and her two brothers were also weavers. Yetta worked in Paterson, but she wanted to be a city girl. The Gibson Girl, like Laura alluded to, was the look of the time, and they wore the shirtwaists. She also made $1 more an hour for a 52-hour work week, which in today's dollars would be approximately $5.70 an hour. I want to speak a little bit about Yetta before the fire. She would probably have been considered one of those radicals. Laura also talked about that. Even during her short life, she was a union member and participated in the 1909 uprising of 20,000. The Triangle workers walked off the job over wage issues, working conditions, and union recognition. As a result, I'm putting this in quotes, they froze and they bled. And there were 700 arrests in all. And after 14 weeks, there were only minor changes. Yetta had been arrested several times before the magistrate. She was not talked about at the family gatherings in Paterson, New Jersey, but probably because of her history. She also had told friends that she was terrified working at the Triangle shop, saying if there was a fire, their lives would be lost. Her obituary reads, all that was left was a closet full of wedding clothes. Yetta's two brothers, Sam and Jake Goldstein, received a telegram Sunday morning to their home in Paterson. When they went to 282 Madison Street, my two great uncles and her fiance, a man by the name of Mr. Cohen, embraced each other. And one said, if only there was only a little bone left for us to identify her. They all started wailing, and with all the other neighbors on the 5th floor. Of course, a 5th floor walk up of the building. Sam grabbed a knife, but it was wrestled away. After going through the remains, she was eventually identified by her signet ring and her cuffed buttons. Her cause of death was asphyxiation. Later on, a friend who had survived the fire said, Yetta had gone back to get her things and missed the elevator. That person was never identified. On March 28th, the day that followed the fire, 3 days that followed the fire, Local 25 of the Shirtwaist Union, the WTUL, and the Workmen's Circle announced plans for a silent procession that would follow the unidentified bodies from the morgue to Mount Zion Cemetery in Maspeth, New Jersey.
It's not there, okay.
That answers Marcy's question because she wanted to know why wasn't she buried in Patterson? Okay, but every year since the 100th anniversary, I've been involved in the commemoration. And March of 2019 brought another project, the commemorative ribbon, to be embossed and draped over the memorial. This was an event held at Fashion Institute of Technology, where gigantic tables were set up and participants were able to personalize the ribbon. My contribution was a silk tie from the Patterson Mill, and my cousin, same relation, Tieta, contributed an embossed fabric with her name. The monument will eventually be erected on the site as what we had. There was a picture just now of the chalking. So, okay, thank you. And okay, anyone who wants to chalk information at the exact address where the victim lived, this is also done annually. So I searched for 282 Madison Street and I found the apartment, and outside, this is what I chalked. Yetta Goldstein, age 20, died Triangle Fire, March 25th, 1911. So I hope this has given you some personal insights into my Aunt Yetta. And that's what goes on every year, the commemoration. Thank you.
Thank you. And now, before we have a chance for questions, I'm going to call on Rhonda Ginsberg to tell us about her grandmother.
Okay, thank you, Elissa. So this one is a happiest story. My grandmother, Bella Zwyman Wolfson, was born in Poland in 1896, and she was one of 13 children. And as was common at that time, some of the children started coming over. Her father came over. I think 2 older brothers came over to the US. And my grandmother, I think, was like the third in line to come over. She came over by herself at 13 years of age. She came over in steerage class on the ship. And she went to work at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory as a 13-year-old. And she was 14 at the time of the fire. And all she said to me about it was that she wasn't there that day because she was sick. What I found out was because it was Shabbos and my grandmother was part of an Orthodox family, she used to call in sick as often as she could on Shabbos. Now, my grandmother, it's hard to see it here. This is her, you know, when she's already older, was a gorgeous 14-year-old. She was 5'10" with red hair and hazel eyes. And I guess she got away with things that a lot of other women or young girls at that point didn't get away with because she was so beautiful. And she used to be able to call in sick, and she was sick the day of the fire. You know, probably she was at services at the time of the fire. So she told me a little bit about the fire. The only thing I remember is that she did lose friends in the fire, one of whom was named Rose. I remember that name because I was named for a great-grandma Rose, so a different person, but, you know, she always felt like my name was commemorating her friend that was lost in the fire also, as well as my great-grandmother from my father's side of the family. This was my mother's mother. So this was a story of the fire that lived on, and my grandmother remembered her friends that died in the fire and, you know, the conditions and everything. You could see my grandmother with my grandfather. My grandfather was about 5'8", so that shows you how tall and statuesque my grandmother was. So she was one of the lucky ones. Her religion and her faith kept her alive because she didn't go to work that day. So that's Grandma Bella. And if she had died in the fire, I wouldn't have been here. So, you know, fate works in strange ways. And, you know, my grandmother lost 7 brothers and sisters to the Holocaust. So, you know, she was lucky in a number of different ways. So that's Grandma Bella's story.
So thank you, Rhonda, and thank you, Michele, for those stories. I'm going to turn this back over to Laura. And if you have any comments about the stories we just heard, or does anyone have any questions?
I'll say something. I know, Michele, you misspoke because when we had rehearsal, you said it was originally you said you made an extra $1 a week. And it was $5 a week. You said per hour now. I assume you just misspoke.
Okay, Laura, I'm turning this back over to you so if you can.
Okay, looks like Roxanne has a question.
Well, it's Lester.
Oh, I'm sorry. It says Roxanne's iPad.
I'm Roxanne. I'm the technologically challenged one. She knows how to hook up these things. Question, I didn't hear you discuss anything about who the owners of the factory were. And I'd be very interested in knowing who they were, some of their background, maybe their ethnicity.
Yeah, there were two men that owned it. They had different last names, so I don't think they were related to one another. But
One was Harris.
Yeah, and the other one
The other
was
was Blank.
Yeah, Blank.
Was the name.
Yeah, and I do believe they were Jewish. So
Yes.
that's very, disconnected, right, to, I think, the people that they were hiring. But this is a period where there isn't a lot of government regulation on business, and there aren't a lot of labor rights for people that are laborers. So, yeah, but very ironic in that way.
Well, what was it about their families? Did they ever repent, express regret?
I haven't
Were they
researched
ever
that.
sued?
That's a great
Were they
question.
ever sued?
I can answer that because I watched
jump in, Marcy.
Right.
I watched the documentary. They were arrested and they were found not guilty. And not exact. And meanwhile, according to this documentary, even their kids happened to be in the building that day, but they made it to the roof and were rescued going to the roof because the offices were on the 10th floor, so they couldn't make it up.
And I did read an account of one woman who survived the fire because she saw them get up and start running one direction. So she thought, well, I'm going to follow them. And they knew where the exits were to get to the roof, but the women working weren't aware. They didn't know where those emergency exits would have been.
Right.
So this particular woman says, all right, if they're going that way, I'm going that way.
They were
And
moved
she
to
ends
the
up
roof.
on the roof with them and she
They were moved
survives.
to-
But did they ever repent? Was there any indication that were they ever
No.
sued?
I haven't read anything about that. That doesn't mean it didn't happen. I haven't read anything about
I
it.
did read in the documentary that they were insured, and so they made out okay.
But I don't think that they repented. I think
No.
that it was sort of one of those like,
it happens.
yeah, it happens,
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think it's Anne.
Yeah, it is I. I think the thing that caught me the most is I had no idea that they were up on the 8th, 9th, and 10th floor. I always thought it was a much lower situation. So thank you for that.
Yeah, and there's, we take for granted fire safety, right? That there's always fire extinguishers, that, there's always fire escapes. And, there weren't. Reparations to the family. Marcy, do you know if there were reparations made to the families? I don't believe there was.
I don't think so. I don't know.
No, I don't think there was. Barbara? I think you're on mute, Barbara.
Okay, is that better?
That's better.
How long after the fire did laws change, and specifically about child labor?
So child labor is really kind of a separate issue that they're already working on. And they're also, this is a period when they're sort of gearing up for public school to be a requirement. It's not yet a requirement, but we're going to start to see soon that it's going to be legal or illegal to keep your kids out of school. And there's this weird sort of philosophy in the history of education for this time period where they're using a lot of the same premises of industrialization that they're using to create education programs. So how do we become more efficient? How do we produce? But it's also coming out of a fear of immigrants that they won't become American enough. So we need to get these kids in school so we can help them assimilate so they can be better Americans. So we're not then, threatening our sort of American identity. So a great irony is that we always think of America as a melting pot, but in reality, there's been this history of xenophobia from the 1820s when we see the first German and Irish immigrants through now, and this fear that immigration is somehow threatening Americanness. So that's somewhat what's going on with children and child labor in schools. By the 1920s, New York City has instituted that there must be fire escapes, there must be a certain number of fire escapes. So within 10 to 20 years, so slow if you're someone that suffered quickly, I think, in the history of sort of industrialization and labor.
So why don't we take one more question, because our program has gone very long today. It's sort of like a Jewish holiday. It lasts for 2 days. Does anyone else have a question?
Ask.
Yes, I do, Elissa. What do you think of the efficacy of the state and city unions as opposed to unionization when the National Labor Relations Act was passed in the 1930s?
Wow, that's very specific. Can you say again?
Yeah, what do you think of how effective the unions, the city and state unions in the 19-teens, 1920s were, as opposed to the National Labor Relations Act passed in the 1930s?
It's kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, right? Because this is even starting in the 1880s and 1890s, this union busting. So, if you've heard of the Pinkerton detectives who were sort of PIs, they're also hired thugs who are going to, like Andrew Carnegie's plants.
Homestead,
Homestead, right, with bricks and baseball bats and beating anybody that is striking and refusing to go to work. So there's definitely this legacy of violence. I think what really makes the union activity, especially amongst women's groups, stronger is when you get the suffragists allying themselves with the union activists. So Alma Belmont, who is one of my favorite characters, I think she was married to one of the Vanderbilts. They get divorced because he's philandering. She takes a bunch of his money and then she gives it to the suffrage movement. She was known as, I can't remember what the term was, if it was like a fur coat activist, but Alma Belmont, who is this incredibly wealthy, privileged woman, goes down to the Lower East Side and starts talking to women like Rose Schneiderman, these labor activists, and saying, why aren't you guys suffragists? And the labor activists are saying, that's not going to serve us. What we need is more immediate change in the factories. And Alma Belmont's able to say, well, but if you could vote, that could happen. And we have money. And if you support our movement, we'll support yours. So we really start to see when these kind of upper class white women that are native born start recruiting the labor activists and the immigrant women for suffrage. We start to see a lot of changes because they've got the cash. But they're also able to say to women like Rose Schneiderman, we don't speak the language. If you will bankroll you, you go speak, right? And so they get women that can go to Italian groups and speak Italian, and to Jewish groups and speak Yiddish. And so what they're avoiding, it's very smart, is that then you don't have this classist resentment that's like, well, this rich lady is coming down and she's slumming it with us and she doesn't understand what we're going through. They have one of their own. So union activity is really only successful through financing and a lot of publicity. So unfortunately, anytime there's these major strikes where they're using children like they did in Lawrence, Massachusetts, or they have a tragedy, that gets things done. Of course, the legislation in the 1930s really then is the thing that's holding the owners accountable. So I think it's difficult to measure about whether you're measuring public response or governmental response or the owner's response. Anytime the media can jump on something too, that ends up eliciting public response. But ultimately, until the 1930s, these things really aren't solidified in the way that they should be, right? The New Deal is the thing that pushes through a minimum wage. It's not labor activity. It's the New Deal. So that's a good question.
Okay, so what I'd like to
But
do.
wait, can I do one thing? I just looked it up for Lester. Lester, they were found not guilty of first and second degree manslaughter, but were found liable of wrongful death during a subsequent civil suit in 1913, in which the plaintiffs were awarded compensation in the amount of $75 per deceased victim. The insurance, however, paid the owners about $60,000 more than the reported losses, or about $400 per casualty. Also in 1913, Blank was once again arrested for locking the doors of the factory during working hours. He was fined $20, which was the minimum amount that could be given.
Okay, so what we're going to do now is Peter and I are thanking you for coming today to our annual meeting and to this program that is our mission of telling the story of the people who were at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. And Jeff, I'd like for us to go back to gallery view, and anyone who wants to ask, Laura, can you stay for a few more minutes?
Yeah, for sure.
And just anyone who wants to chime in or ask a question, that's fine in a minute. But Peter, I'll give you the last word.
Can I speak? The one thing that I wanted to say was that it's because of the unions that we developed a middle class that would never have happened without the unions. And as time progressed, they got a really bad rap.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you, Barbara. And I'll turn this over to Peter, and then we're gonna be open. We can schmooze, we can chat, we can ask questions, but if you are leaving, thank you so much for coming. And Peter?
Just wanted to say what a phenomenal presentation, Laura. Thank you very much. And you can tell by the attendance, the interest that there is in the story, and you really brought that message home to us and to me. I never knew the extent of the tragedy. And thank you very much. And thank you all for coming, and look forward to being with you all and sharing wonderful stories again. And Elissa, thank you.
Okay, so anyone who just open up your mic and whatever you have to say.
Unmuted.
Okay.
I'm back. I'm back.
Hi, Roxanne. I can hear you.
Hi, Roxanne Lester. One question. What was there any role played by the Jewish clergy at that prior to or subsequent to that time? Now, I'm particularly asking because I believe the reform movement was in development at that time, which I'm just making an observation.
Yeah,
I'm just wondering, did the Jewish clergy come up and say, this is just un-Jewish?
Admittedly, I'm not a Jewish historian. So I'm a women's historian, so I'm mostly studying the experiences of women. So I'm not sure if there was any sort of involvement from the clergy with the unions or condemnation of the factory owners. I mean, I would gather to guess that the role would most likely have been comforting the families as opposed to something so overtly political, but I'm not really entirely sure. That's a good question, though.
Do you know when public education was started in New York City and when it was mandated?
Oh, good question.
Because I thought it started before 1900s. And so when you said like the kids were running around the streets, I'm not sure when it was mandated, but I would have think these parents would have, and then also at that point, there was also adult education for the immigrants to learn English. And do you know what the timeline was for children when there were schools available and when it became mandated?
So in New York State, it's 1918. It's very state dependent. So like Massachusetts is a leader in this, and they're making it mandatory in the 1850s. But New York State, it's not until 1918. So the education programs you're referencing, though, would have been very community oriented, right? That's not necessarily something that's coming from the city or the state. So there are adult education programs. Obviously, there are public schools. It's just that there's no requirement that you have to go. And I think that for families that are working out of their homes in the garment industry, you just want the kids like out of the way, you know, get out of here, it's too
School would be
crowded.
a good place to go out of the way.
Well, and that's part of why Jacob Reese, you know, he's a really controversial kind of character from the standpoint that he is a social reformer. He's one of the first social workers. He goes to the Lower East Side and says, why are there no parks? This is disgusting. You know, there's horse feces in the streets, there's dirty water. And he really pushes the parks movement so that families have a place to go and that children have a place to play. But he writes this book called How the Other Half Lives, and he's describing all of these neighborhoods, and he's taking photographs of these neighborhoods. Now, the thing that makes it controversial by our modern standards is his descriptions are very racist. So the ways that he's describing being in Chinatown as opposed to an Italian block, as opposed to a Jewish block, he's describing people in a very stereotypical way. He's describing the way the language sounds very stereotypically. He's describing the food smells very stereotypically. But it's his book that really gets the attention of the city government, because for a lot of these officials, it's out of sight, out of mind. You don't go down there, and so you don't care. And when he publishes all of these photographs, people are then outraged that people would be living in this kind of squalor, and they put a lot of pressure on the government. And so Reese is able to get money to start building parks and start cleaning up the Lower East Side.
Thank you.
You know, my interest is in the gangsters and pirates and gangsters. But the gangsters that included Arnold Rothstein and Buchhalter all were involved in the garment industry and supposedly unionizing. And that was in the 20s and early 30s.
Yeah.
And they were collecting millions of dollars and not giving very much or caring very much for the people that they're working with.
Right. Right. It's a period that, you know, is incredible business corruption and not a lot of community support. And keep in mind, you know, this is prior to something like unemployment insurance, disability insurance. You get hurt on the job, that's your problem. That's one of the arguments the child labor activists are making, is that you've got 6-year-olds crawling in the gears of machines because they're small and they can fit. But if they lose an arm, that's not the owner's problem. And now you've got someone who's disabled, who is not from a comfortable economic situation, who's now going to have problems the whole rest of their life finding work. But, you know, one of the things too that's tragic about this time period is the way the disabled are treated, because there's no care in place for them. So a lot of the social services that we you know, we enjoy and we take for granted aren't present at this time. And so it is a political climate, right, and a business climate ripe for corruption because no one's regulating anything. There's an interesting book called Annie's Ghosts, and a journalist wrote it because when his mother died, he was going through her papers and found that she had a sister that he never knew about. And I'm trying to remember if they were from New York, but it was somewhere urban on the East Coast. And his grandparents were Jewish immigrants. And he was talking about the pressure that they felt trying to get their children married into good families, and that this daughter who would have been physically and mentally disabled, there was a fear that that would have been genetic. I think it was likely trauma from during birth, that it was just a bad delivery, but there was fear in the community that that would be genetic. And so no one wanted to marry the other children, so they send her away to a mental institution. And so he's researching whatever he can find on this terrible care in these mental institutions, but then why culturally the family would have done it and how difficult it was for them, and how his grandmother like really never recovered from the guilt of sending this daughter away, but that she had to do it if she was going to get her other daughters married. So interesting tension during the time.
Well, you know, I had an aunt, not great, that I never knew I had until I was in my 20s or the teens. It was the youngest sister. She was Down syndrome.
Yeah.
And it was actually the teacher who approached my other aunt and said, I want to speak to your mother, my grandmother, because she was afraid for her Sophie on the streets of New York.
Mhm.
She was afraid she was very friendly, outgoing, that she would be attacked. So they wound up sending her to a school. And my grandparents said upstate New York. It was probably Westchester.
Mhm.
But because they were fearful for her, it was not they were trying to get rid of her,
Right.
but because it was on the streets of New York, it was just, you know, they were just afraid for her.
Right. Right. Other questions?
Okay.
Thank you so much. That was just wonderful.
Good. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for having
Thank you
me.
very much, Laura.
Laura, and everyone have a wonderful day. I'll
Thank
leave
you.
the
Thank you. A
Jeff,
wonderful
let's go to
program.